It was the spring of 1968, and life in the small town of Willow Creek moved at its own slow, steady rhythm. The world outside was changing rapidly. Civil rights marches, anti-war protests, and the rise of Motown filled the air with a sense of urgency. But for 62-year-old Raymond Parker, time had settled into a predictable, almost stubborn pace. He'd been driving the number 14 bus for over 25 years, and every day felt much the same. Each morning, he brewed a pot of black coffee, sat at the small kitchen table, and watched the sun slowly stretch its fingers across the lawn. His modest home, once filled with the warmth of his late wife Evelyn's laughter, now felt too quiet. The smell of her Sunday peach cobbler no longer lingered in the kitchen, and her favorite rocking chair by the window sat still, gathering dust. For 8 long years, Raymond convinced himself that this kind of quiet was just part of getting older. "Ain't no use complaining," he'd mutter under his breath, sipping his coffee. "Ain't nobody here to listen anyway." But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, something extraordinary happened. It began like any other day. Raymond climbed into the driver's seat of the number 14 bus, adjusted the rearview mirror, and pulled out from the station with the soft hiss of hydraulics. The familiar route took him through the heart of Willow Creek, past the barber shop where the old men gathered to argue about baseball, past the bakery where Mrs. Calloway's fresh cinnamon rolls perfumed the air, and past the old library with its cracked stone steps. As he turned the corner onto Main Street, he saw her, a woman standing at the bus stop near Willow Avenue. She wasn't someone he'd seen before, and in a town as small as Willow Creek, new faces always stood out. She wore a powder blue church dress, the kind with delicate lace trimming at the sleeves, and a small white hat tilted slightly to the side. In one hand, she held a brown paper bag filled to the brim with groceries. Her other hand gripped the handle of an old leather purse that had clearly seen better days. She glanced at her watch, then at the road, clearly annoyed that the bus was running late. Raymond slowed the bus to a stop, opened the door with a familiar whoosh, and leaned forward, his eyes squinting slightly against the sun. "You getting on, or you just here for the scenery?" he said with a crooked grin, the dimple in his left cheek deepening. The woman tilted her head, her brow raised in mock disapproval. "If you drove this thing like you had someplace to be, I wouldn't be standing here waiting," she shot back without missing a beat. Raymond chuckled as she stepped onto the bus with slow, deliberate grace, her heels clicking lightly on the floor. She paid her fare with exact change. No fumbling, no hesitation, then glanced at him with sharp, knowing eyes. "You gonna drive, or you need me to do it for you?" she asked, tossing him a glance over her shoulder as she took a seat directly behind him. The other passengers raised their eyebrows, half smiling as they exchanged amused glances. Everyone knew Raymond Parker wasn't used to being checked like that, especially not by a woman who looked as put together as she did. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a quick comeback. Instead, he gripped the wheel, glanced in the rearview mirror, and muttered under his breath, "Got a live one today." Over the next week, she was there every morning at the same stop, right on schedule. Her name, as he soon learned, was Dolores Henderson, a 60-year-old retired schoolteacher who had recently moved to town to be closer to her sister. She had a voice that carried, a walk with purpose, and a smile that seemed to know more than she let on. She sat in the same seat every day, directly behind Raymond, and each ride brought a new conversation. On the third day, she asked him, "You ever get tired of driving in circles, Raymond?" He glanced at her in the mirror, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Only when I'm driving in circles alone," he replied. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Smart answer, Mr. Parker. Smart answer." From then on, their conversations grew longer and deeper. She'd tell him about her teaching days, about the students who made her proud and the ones who tested every ounce of her patience. "I had a boy named Earl Watson," she said one day. "That child could make a saint lose her wings." Raymond laughed so hard he had to pull the bus over for a moment. "I know that type," he said, wiping his eyes. "They the ones that turn out to be preachers or politicians." As days turned into weeks, Raymond realized he was looking forward to seeing her. When he reached that stop on Willow Avenue, his heart lifted just a little. If she wasn't there, his eyes scanned the street, searching for that familiar powder blue dress or the sight of her carefully curled hair. The other riders started to notice, too. Mr. Parker got himself a sweetheart, teased with a young man who worked at the sawmill. Raymond just grunted as fixed on the road. But deep down, he knew they weren't entirely wrong. He hadn't felt this way in years, that small flicker of excitement when someone steps into your world and makes it feel a little bigger. He didn't say it out loud, of course, but he knew. One Friday morning, Dolores didn't board the bus. Raymond stopped as usual, opened the door, and waited a few seconds longer than normal. When she didn't appear, he frowned, his eyes scanning the street like a man looking for a lost set of keys. The next day, she wasn't there either. By the third day, he felt the absence of her presence as clearly as he felt the weight of his bus driver's uniform on his back. "She all right?" asked Mrs. Calloway, the baker who rode the bus to the market. Raymond didn't answer, just nodded and kept driving. By the end of that week, he couldn't help himself. On his lunch break, he walked to the address she had casually mentioned once in conversation. It was a modest little house with a white picket fence and azaleas blooming in front. He knocked once, then again, his heart thudding harder than it had in years. When the door finally opened, Dolores stood there, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, looking smaller than she had on the bus. "Well, look who's come knocking," she said, a soft smile curling her lips. "Didn't think I was worth a house call, Mr. Parker." She coughed into her elbow, and that's when Raymond noticed the tiredness in her eyes. "You feeling all right, Miss Henderson?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. "I'm fine, just a little under the weather." "Ain't no big deal," she replied, waving it off like a pesky fly. But Raymond could see past it. He'd seen that look before, that quiet strength people wore when they didn't want to be seen as weak. "I tell you what," he said, pulling a small piece of paper from his pocket. "Here's my number. You call me if you need anything." She glanced at the paper, then at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked a little unsure. "You do this for all your passengers, Mr. Parker?" she asked, her eyes narrowing playfully. "Just the ones worth waiting for," he replied. She laughed, a quiet, breathy laugh that sounded like the beginning of a song. That night, Raymond sat in his living room, his hands folded in his lap, thinking about her. He wondered if she had eaten, if she was warm enough, and if she'd ever call that number he'd left her. His mind wandered, imagining the sight of her sitting at her kitchen table, perhaps alone like he'd been for so long. His phone didn't ring that night, nor the next. But on the third night, just as he was settling into bed, the phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. He answered it on the second ring. "Hello," he said, his voice a little hoarse from sleep. There was a pause, then a familiar voice. "I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Parker," she said quietly. "For what?" he asked, smiling into the darkness. "For remembering me," she replied. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It was the kind that makes you feel like someone else is breathing in rhythm with you. "Anytime, Ms. Henderson," he said softly. "Anytime." After that late-night phone call, something shifted between Raymond and Dolores. It wasn't dramatic, like a sudden burst of fireworks, but more like the slow, steady glow of a lantern on a foggy night, subtle but impossible to ignore. Dolores returned to riding the number 14 bus the following week, and though she still sat in the same seat behind him, the energy between them had changed. Before, their conversations had been light and playful, like two strangers swapping jokes to pass the time. But now it felt more personal, more deliberate. Every morning she'd ask him, "How you sleep last night, Mr. Parker?" as if she'd been thinking about him after they hung up the phone. And every morning he'd reply, "Better than I have in years, Miss Henderson," and they'd share a quiet smile. Neither one of them ever admitted it out loud, but both knew what was happening. They were becoming each other's person, slowly and without permission. Their talks grew longer, and the topics grew deeper. Dolores talked about her younger days as a schoolteacher, describing her first class of students like they were her own children. "They had me nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof," she said one morning, shaking her head as if the memory itself was exhausting. "But by the end of the year, I knew every one of them like they were mine." She shared stories about the pranks they pulled, like the time a boy named Reggie released a frog in the middle of the classroom. "Took me 2 whole days to figure out where that thing was hiding," she said, chuckling so hard she had to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. Every time I'd hear a rib bit, the whole class would bust out Logan. Raymond listened, glancing in a rearview mirror between stops, and something about her voice, the way it rose and fell like a lullaby, made him feel at ease. He told her about his childhood too, about growing up in a house with 6 brothers and a mother who could silence them all with a single look. "We didn't have much, but Mama always said, 'You ain't poor if your love's rich,'" he recalled, his eyes softening at the memory. The other passengers noticed the change too. Miss Calloway, the baker, started calling them the lovebirds of Route 14. The teenage boys who sat in the back started cracking jokes. "When y'all getting married, Mr. Parker?" one of them hollered one afternoon, earning laughter from the whole bus. Raymond rolled his eyes, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, but he didn't deny it. If anything, he glanced up at Dolores in the mirror, and she just tilted her head with that sly, knowing smile. "Don't listen to them boys," she said calmly. "They think love's just something you find on TV." Raymond chuckled at that, his eyes crinkling at the edges, but the word stayed with him. Maybe love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Maybe love was just showing up. Their bond grew stronger in small, ordinary moments. One rainy afternoon, Dolores boarded the bus soaked from head to toe. Her powder blue dress was damp, and her curls had lost their shape from the downpour. As she took her seat, Raymond glanced at her in the mirror and frowned. At the next stop, he reached behind his seat, grabbed his old work jacket, and handed it to her without a word. Dolores hesitated for a moment, looking at him as if trying to read his intentions. Then she smiled softly and draped the coat over her lap. "Thank you, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "You're welcome, Miss Henderson," he replied, eyes forward on the road, but his heart was somewhere else entirely. She returned the coat the next morning, folded so neatly it looked brand new. Tucked into the front pocket was a small handwritten note. "Don't forget that kindness comes back around. Dolores." Raymond read it twice before tucking it into his wallet, where it stayed for years. Another time, Dolores brought him lunch. It wasn't a big production, just a brown paper bag with a ham sandwich, an apple, and a small slice of homemade pound cake wrapped in foil. "Figured you shouldn't be eating them gas station snacks every day," she said, handing it to him as she boarded the bus. Raymond opened the bag during his lunch break, staring at the carefully packed meal like it was a 5-course dinner. The sandwich had just the right amount of mustard, and the cake melted in his mouth like butter on a warm skillet. He didn't say much to her about it, but the next morning, when she got on the bus, she found a small bag of fresh peaches sitting on her seat. "Looked like you might be running low," Raymond said with a wink. From that day on, their quiet exchanges became a tradition. Little gifts back and forth, small signs of care that said more than words ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Raymond decided to take a walk. He wasn't a man who liked unplanned outings, but something about the day felt different. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and for once, he didn't feel like sitting in his house alone. As he strolled through Willow Creek, hands in his coat pockets, he spotted Dolores down the road, kneeling in her front yard with a small spade in hand. She was planting flowers, azaleas, bright pink and white, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stood there for a moment, watching her, debating whether to walk over or keep moving. But before he could decide, she glanced up, saw him, and waved like they'd been friends for years. "You just gonna stand there like a statue, or are you gonna help me plant these flowers?" she called out. Her voice was light, teasing, but there was something behind it too, an invitation. He walked over, pulled off his coat, and crouched down beside her. "Where you want me?" he asked, glancing at the small plot of earth she'd been digging. She handed him a second spade. "Right there," she said, pointing. "Azaleas don't plant themselves, Mr. Parker." The two of them worked in comfortable silence, the soft sounds of birds chirping overhead and the scrape of metal against dirt filling the air. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same flower. Dolores glanced up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Careful, Mr. Parker," she said softly, her smile slow but steady. "Don't go fallin' for me now." He tilted his head, gazing at her with a kind of quiet intensity that only comes with age. "Too late for that, Miss Henderson," he said, his voice low and sure. She blinked, her breath catching for just a second, and then she laughed, a real full laugh that echoed in the air like music. As they sat on the porch later, wiping dirt from their hands, she leaned back in her chair and glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "You always this stubborn, Raymond Parker?" she asked. He raised a brow. "Only when it's worth it," he replied, his voice gruff but his meaning clear. She didn't say anything after that, just sipped her iced tea with small private smile on her face. That day, he didn't leave her house until the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. It wasn't because they had more flowers to plant. It wasn't because she'd asked him to stay. It was because, for the first time in years, Raymond didn't feel like he had to be anywhere else. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about her again. Dolores Henderson, the woman with the powder blue dress, the sharp tongue, and the quiet way she slipped into his life like she'd always belonged there. He thought about how for 8 years his home had felt too big, his days too quiet, and his heart too heavy. But somehow, in the span of a few weeks, all of that had begun to change. He hadn't planned on it. He hadn't even seen it coming. But there it was. As he closed his eyes, his last thought before sleep took him was simple, but it made him smile. "Love don't always knock loud," he muttered to himself. "Sometimes it just sits behind you on the bus." The summer of 1968 had been one of the hottest on record in Willow Creek. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small town, causing front porch gossipers to fan themselves with church bulletins and kids to run barefoot across the blistering pavement. But as the season wore on, the heat broke with a fury. By late July, dark clouds rolled in like a slow-moving wall of gray, bringing with them the promise of rain. The storm warnings came over the radio just after lunchtime. Severe thunderstorm alert for all of Chatham County. High winds, potential flooding, and power outages expected. Most folks in town took it seriously. They tied down porch furniture, secured their windows, and made sure they had candles and flashlights ready. But for Raymond Parker, it was business as usual. Rain didn't stop the number 14 bus from running, and he had a shift to complete. Storm or not, people still got to get where they're going, he muttered as he buttoned up his work jacket and headed out the door. Dolores wasn't at her usual stop that afternoon. Raymond glanced toward the sidewalk as he pulled up, expecting to see her standing there with her purse slung over one arm and a bag of groceries in the other. But there was no sign of her. His brow furrowed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange pang of worry. Probably stayed home, he told himself, gripping the wheel tighter as thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began to pelt the windshield in fat, heavy drops that sounded like marbles hitting glass. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror more often than usual, his eyes darting to each new passenger who boarded, half expecting to see Dolores's familiar face. But she wasn't there. His chest felt tight, but he brushed it off. She's smart. She's probably home watching TV like everybody else, he muttered. Still, the ride felt longer that day, and every flash of lightning outside the window made him grip the steering wheel a little harder. By the time he finished his shift, the storm had intensified. The sky was a swirling mess of black and gray, and rain poured down so hard that it looked like fog hanging in air. Tree branches swayed wildly, and the wind howled like a wild animal. After parking the bus at the depot, Raymond debated for a moment. He could head straight home, warm dinner, dry clothes, and a chance to rest his aching back. But something didn't feel right. His mind kept circling back to Dolores. The thought of her being alone in that little house on Willow Avenue didn't sit right with him. He didn't like the idea of her without power, without help, and without anyone checking on her. Before he could second-guess himself, he grabbed his coat and headed back out into the rain. The walk to Dolores's house wasn't far, but in a storm like that, it felt like miles. Rain soaked through his coat within minutes, his boots splashed through puddles, and sharp gusts of wind pushed against him like invisible hands. He tilted his head down, shielding his face from the rain, and kept walking. Every crack of thunder made his heart jump, but he pushed forward, muttering to himself, "Just a little further, old man. Ain't nothing but rain." When he finally reached her street, he spotted her house up ahead, small, but well-kept, with a row of pink azaleas blooming out front. But something wasn't right. The porch light was off, and every window was pitch black. No light, no glow from a television, no flicker of a candle. His pace quickened, heart thudding harder than it should have. As he reached the front steps, he knocked hard. "Dolores, you in there?" "It's Raymond." He waited. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, his fists hitting the wood like thunder. Still nothing. His eyes darted toward the side window, and that's when he noticed it, a small shadow moving behind the curtains. Relief swept over him, but it didn't last long. Something about the way it moved was off, slow, and uneven. "Dolores," he called out, leaning close to the window. He cupped his hands around his eyes, trying to peer inside through the rain-streaked glass. He could barely make out a figure moving toward the door. Moments later, he heard the click of the lock. The door creaked open just a crack, and there she was. Dolores stood there in her housecoat, her face pale, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Her hair, usually so neatly curled, was loose around her face, and she was leaning against the doorframe like it was the only thing holding her up. "Raymond," she mumbled, her voice faint and shaky. That's when he knew something was wrong. "You sick, Miss Henderson?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She opened her mouth to answer, but a sudden cough racked her body, bending her forward. He reached out to steady her, one hand on her back, his heart pounding in his chest. All right, sit down," he said firmly, guiding her to the old floral print armchair in the living room. The power was out, and the only light came from the flashes of lightning outside. The air inside the house felt too still, too quiet. Raymond crouched in front of her, his hands on her knees. "When did this start?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She shook her head. "Couple days ago," she muttered, her eyes barely able to stay open. "Thought it'd pass, but it ain't passin'." Her breathing was shallow, each inhale sounding like it had to fight its way in. Raymond didn't hesitate. He glanced at the phone on the wall, but the line was dead. He knew the storm had knocked out the power, and with it, the phone service too. He thought about going to get help, but leaving her alone in that condition didn't sit right with him. "You got any medicine? Anything for fever or cough?" he asked. She nodded weakly, gesturing toward the bathroom. Raymond moved quickly, rummaging through the medicine cabinet until he found a bottle of cough syrup and some aspirin. He poured a spoonful, sat beside her, and lifted it to her lips like she was a child. She gave him a tired, grateful look before taking the medicine. "Thank you," she said softly, leaning her head back against the chair. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, eyes flicking toward the window as another bolt of lightning lit up the room. The storm raged outside, but inside, Raymond stayed with her. He found an old quilt draped over the couch and laid it across her lap. Every so often, he'd check her breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest like a man watching a clock ticking down. Hours passed. Rain battered the roof like drumming fingertips, and thunder shook the walls. Dolores drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing still shallow but steady. At some point, she opened her eyes and whispered, "You didn't have to stay." Raymond glanced at her, his face lined with concern but softened by something else, something that had been growing quietly between them for weeks. "Yeah, I did," he said simply. She gazed at him for a long moment, her eyes full of something unspoken. "Ain't nobody done that for me in a long time," she admitted quietly. Raymond leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Well, I ain't just anybody," he replied, his eyes still watching her carefully. She smiled at that, small but genuine, and closed her eyes again. He sat there for the rest of the night, eyes half closed, his body tired but his mind alert. When the storm finally passed, the rain softened to a gentle patter and dawn light seeped in through the curtains. Raymond glanced at Dolores, still resting peacefully, her breathing stronger than before. He exhaled slowly, leaning his head back against the chair. "You a stubborn woman, Dolores Henderson," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. But he wasn't mad about it. Not one bit. When she woke the next morning, her eyes met his, and for the first time she didn't call him Mr. Parker. "Raymond," she said softly, her voice still hoarse but steady. "You stayed." He nodded slowly, rubbing his eyes. "Course I did." She gazed at him, eyes full of quiet gratitude. "Guess I owe you a breakfast," she said with a small grin. Raymond let out a tired chuckle, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Yeah," he said, his voice warm and steady. "I reckon you do." After the storm passed, everything felt different. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the way fresh rain makes the world smell cleaner and brighter. For Dolores and Raymond, it was as if the storm had washed away the invisible wall that had been keeping them at arm's length. From that day on, Raymond didn't just think of Dolores as a passenger on his route or a neighbor he'd occasionally check on. She was something more now, a presence in his life that he didn't want to lose. And she seemed to feel it too. When she got back to riding the number 14 bus, she didn't just sit behind him anymore. She sat right next to him at the front, on the bench seat by the door. Every passenger who boarded noticed it too. They'd glance at her, then at him, and smile knowingly. One old man named Mr. Charlie even said, "Well, if that ain't the prettiest co-pilot I ever seen," to which Dolores replied, "Somebody's got to keep him from getting lost." The whole bus erupted in laughter, but Raymond didn't mind. He just grinned, his eyes crinkling at the edges, and kept driving. Their connection deepened with every shared ride, every quiet conversation, and every unspoken moment that passed between them. On Thursdays, Dolores started bringing him little homemade meals, cornbread muffins, fried catfish wrapped in foil, or slices of sweet potato pie. She'd hand him the small brown bag with a smile and say, "Don't let them boys in the back try to steal it now." He'd nod, tuck it under his seat, and make sure to thank her properly when they got to her stop. "I ain't never had cornbread that soft," he told her one day, rubbing his belly after his shift. She raised an eyebrow and said, "That's 'cause you've been eating that store-bought mess." She wasn't wrong. Her food tasted like Sunday afternoons and family reunions, the kind of meals that come from generations of practice. On his days off, he started visiting her house unannounced. It wasn't planned, at least not at first. One Saturday, he'd been on his way to the hardware store when he spotted her in her front yard, hanging fresh sheets on the clothesline. The way the white fabric caught the wind, billowing like sails, made him stop in his tracks. He watched her for a moment, the way she moved with slow, deliberate care, her hands smoothing the edges of each sheet before clipping it to the line. She spotted him and called out, "You gonna stand there watching? Or are you gonna help me hang these up?" Her voice carried that same teasing edge it always did, but there was something softer underneath it now. Without a word, he walked over, rolled up his sleeves, and started hanging sheets beside her. "You ever hung clothes on a line before, Mr. Parker?" she asked, her hands moving with practiced precision. He smirked, glancing at her. "I grew up with 6 brothers, Ms. Henderson. You think Mama let us get away without doing chores?" She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the clothespin. That became a new part of their rhythm. Saturday afternoons were spent on her front porch, sipping sweet tea and talking about the old days. They swapped stories like old friends. Dolores talked about her first love, a boy named Leon who moved to Chicago and never wrote her back. "Taught me not to wait on no man," she said, tapping the side of her glass with a long, thoughtful pause. Raymond told her about his father, a man so strict he'd make them recite Bible verses before dinner. "And if you got one word wrong," Raymond said, shaking his head, "he'd make you start all over from Genesis." They both laughed until tears filled their eyes. It was the kind of laughter that left your heart feeling a little lighter, like a weight you didn't know you'd been carrying had finally lifted. But it wasn't just the big moments that brought them closer. It was the small, quiet ones, like the time she noticed him rubbing his hands after driving the bus all day. Without saying a word, she pulled out a jar of homemade peppermint salve from her kitchen and set it on the table in front of him. "That'll fix those aches," she said simply, sitting across from him with her hands folded. He didn't argue. He rubbed the salve into his fingers, feeling the cool, tingling sensation seep into his skin. "You always carry around magic in a jar?" he asked, holding up the little tin. She shrugged, her eyes twinkling. "You live long enough, you learn a few tricks." Moments like that stayed with him. One night, after dinner at her house, the two of them sat on her front porch swing, the soft creak of the chains keeping time like an old metronome. Fireflies flickered in the grass, and the warm hum of crickets filled the air. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of stillness that only comes when two people have nothing to prove. After a while, Dolores glanced at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Raymond," she said softly, "you ever think about what it means to start over?" He glanced at her, his face calm but curious. "Start over how?" She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "I mean, after you lose someone. After you've already lived a whole life with somebody else. You think it's possible to love again, or do you just carry it with you?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the weight in it. He knew what she was really asking. She wasn't just talking about him. She was talking about herself. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the fireflies dancing in the grass. "I think love don't leave," he said slowly, as if he were figuring it out as he spoke. "It changes, sure, but it don't leave. I think if you're lucky, you can carry it with you and still have room for something new." She didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her eyes studying his face like she was seeing him in a new light. Finally, she nodded. "That's a good answer, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That's a real good answer." They sat in silence for a long time after that, just watching the fireflies flicker on and off like tiny lanterns in the dark. In the weeks that followed, their bond only grew stronger. She started calling him more often, sometimes just to tell him about the weather or to share a recipe she'd found. "Try this in your grits next time," she'd say, her voice warm with familiarity. He'd laugh, but he always wrote down her suggestions on a scrap of paper. They didn't need grand gestures. They didn't need declarations of love. It was there in the small things, the way she set an extra plate at dinner when she knew he might stop by, or the way he always checked her front porch after a storm, just to make sure everything was still in place. It was in the way she never called him Mr. Parker anymore. Just Raymond. The town noticed, of course. Willow Creek wasn't big enough for love to stay a secret. Miss Calloway told anyone who'd listen, "Those two been sitting on that porch swing so long. I'm surprised it ain't worn down to the wood." But Dolores didn't care, and neither did Raymond. On Sunday mornings, they started walking to church together, side by side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It wasn't something they talked about. It just happened. The older folks in the congregation noticed, giving them quiet nods of approval. The younger folks teased them, but it was always good-natured. "Y'all look like a Hallmark card," one of the young girls said, grinning. Dolores just waved her off with a laugh. "Don't be jealous, child," she called back. But for all the smiles and teasing, there was something real beneath it. They'd both lost before. They both knew what it was like to sit in a quiet house and feel the weight of time pressing down on them. That's why they didn't rush anything. They didn't have to. Love, they'd learned, wasn't about rushing. It was about showing up again and again until the weight didn't feel so heavy anymore. It was about putting down roots, just like those azaleas they'd planted together. You water it, you tend to it, and one day it blooms. And one quiet evening, as they sat on that porch swing, Dolores reached over, took his hand in hers and held it. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Raymond looked down at their hands, rough calloused fingers entwined, and smiled. "You all right, Miss Henderson?" he asked, glancing at her. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, Raymond," she said softly. "I'm all right." It was one of those late autumn afternoons when the sun hovered low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow on everything it touched. The air smelled like dry leaves and wood smoke, and the faint chill of the coming winter could be felt in the breeze. Dolores and Raymond were on the front porch again, sipping on cups of spiced tea she'd brewed earlier that morning. They didn't talk much that day. They didn't need to. The world felt still, the way it does right before the first frost. Raymond leaned back in the porch swing, his eyes half closed, one hand resting on the armrest while Dolores flipped through an old photo album she'd pulled from the house. The album was worn, its leather cover cracked at the edges, and the photos inside were faded but still clear enough to tell their stories. "You ever look back and wonder if you did it right?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but steady. She didn't look at him when she asked. Her eyes were focused on a picture of herself, younger and full of life, standing beside a tall, broad-shouldered man. Raymond opened one eye and glanced at her. "Did what right?" he asked. "Life," she replied, still staring at the photo. Her fingers traced the edge of it, her nails softly tapping the page. "Love? Family? All of it." She sighed, closing the album slowly and setting it on her lap. Raymond leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a slow breath. "Ain't no right way, Dolores. Just do what you can with what you got. Rest is up to the good Lord." She nodded, her eyes still on the album, but she didn't seem satisfied with his answer. Her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. Raymond could feel it. He knew that look, the look of somebody trying to decide whether to open a door they'd kept closed for too long. "You all right, Dolores?" he asked, tilting his head toward her. She hesitated, fingers tapping the album's leather cover. "There's something I ought to tell you, Raymond," she said finally, glancing at him with those sharp, thoughtful eyes. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Raymond straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "Ain't no better time than now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded slowly, staring down at her hands like she was gathering her courage. "Back when I was younger," she began, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it, "I had a son." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but heavy. Raymond blinked, his face unreadable. "A son," he repeated, leaning in just a bit, his eyes locked on hers. She nodded, her eyes lifting to meet his. "His name was Isaiah," she said, and there was a crack in her voice when she said his name, like the sound of an old branch snapping under too much weight. Her hands gripped the photo album tighter. "I had him when I was just 19. His father? Well, his father wasn't the kind of man you keep around long." She laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes after years of trying to make peace with something that never quite settled right. Raymond stayed quiet, letting her talk. He knew better than to rush someone when they were opening old wounds. "When Isaiah was little, I did everything I could to give him a good life," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I worked long hours, took on night shifts at the diner, paid for his school clothes with tip money. But when he turned 16, he started running with the wrong crowd." Her eyes shifted to the horizon, gazing at something far away that only she could see. "I tried to stop him. Lord knows I tried. But boys that age, they think they know everything." She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing like she was trying to push down something too big to swallow. "One night, he got caught up in some trouble with his friends. Police said it was a robbery gone wrong." Her voice broke on the last word. "They gave him 25 years. Silence fell over the porch. The birds stopped chirping, the rustling of leaves suddenly felt louder, and all Raymond could hear was the sound of her breathing. He leaned back slowly, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Is he still in there?" he asked, his voice careful, like he didn't want to step on something fragile. Dolores nodded, wiping the corner of her eye with the sleeve of her sweater. "Yeah," she whispered. 23 years later, and he's still in there." She laughed again, but it was hollow. "Ain't it funny? I spent all that time trying to keep him out of trouble, and now he's living in a box smaller than this porch." She shook her head, letting out a sharp breath like she was trying to steady herself. Raymond didn't speak right away. He leaned forward, rubbed his hands together, and stared at the ground like he was trying to solve a puzzle in his mind. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes steady and full of something that wasn't pity. It was something closer to understanding. "You still talk to him?" he asked. Dolores nodded. "Yeah. Letters, mostly. I visit when I can, but you know how it is." She glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. "You think different of me now, Raymond?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp, like she was bracing herself for an answer she didn't want to hear. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing just a little. "Different," he repeated, letting the words sit on his tongue. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, Dolores. I just think more of you now." Her eyes flickered wide for a moment like she didn't believe what she'd heard. Then her face softened, her shoulders relaxing like she'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "That boy of yours still got a mama who loves him," Raymond added, his voice warm and sure. "That counts for something." They sat in silence for a long while, the autumn air cool but not cold. The golden light of the setting sun poured across the porch, bathing them both in soft orange light. Dolores stared at the photo album in her lap, her fingers gently brushing the leather cover. "He used to draw little pictures for me when he was little," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Said he was going to be an artist one day." She smiled softly. "Still sends me sketches in his letters. Said he's got a whole notebook full of them." Her eyes glowed with quiet pride, even if her heart was heavy. "You should bring some next time," Raymond said, his voice low and steady. I'd like to some. Her eyes flicked toward him, her face shifting from surprise to something softer, something closer to gratitude. I might just do that, she said, nodding slowly. That night, as Raymond sat at his kitchen table, eating one of Dolores's sweet potato pies, he couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. About Isaiah. About how life could twist and bend you in ways you never saw coming. He thought about his own kids, 2 sons and a daughter, all grown now with kids of their own. He'd been lucky with them, but he knew it wasn't always about luck. It was about grace. The next morning, when Dolores got on the bus, Raymond handed her a brown paper bag just like she always did for him. She raised an eyebrow, glancing inside to see a small sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. For Isaiah, Raymond said simply. Her eyes filled with tears faster than she could stop them. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand for just a moment. Thank you, Raymond, she said, her voice full of something more than gratitude. He didn't say much after that, just tipped his hat, glanced at her, and drove on. But as he watched her out of the corner of his eye, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Something stronger than sadness, stronger than regret. It was hope. It was small, quiet, and fragile, but it was there. And Raymond knew better than anyone that sometimes hope was all you needed to keep going. Winter arrived in Willow Creek slowly, like an old man taking his time getting out of bed. The mornings were colder, the sun stayed low in the sky, and frost began to cling to the edges of the window panes. For Raymond and Dolores, the days had fallen into a steady rhythm, one that neither of them had dared to name, but both of them understood. They didn't call it love, not out loud. But love doesn't always need a name. It was there in the quiet mornings when she handed him a thermos of hot coffee before his shift. It was there when he checked her front porch after every storm, making sure nothing had been knocked over. It was in the way they sat together on that old swing, watching the world go by, their hands close enough to touch but never quite needing to. They had built something out of the small, steady pieces of each day, and for people who'd seen as much loss as they had, that was enough. But as the holidays approached, something felt different. Dolores had been quieter than usual. She still smiled, still teased him every morning on the bus, but there was something behind her eyes, a far-off look, like she was carrying something too heavy to set down. Raymond noticed. He always noticed. "You all right, Miss Henderson?" he asked one afternoon as they sat on her porch, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from the oak tree in her yard. She nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "I'm fine, Raymond," she said, her voice too light, too practiced. He didn't push her. He'd learned by now that Dolores Henderson didn't say anything she wasn't ready to say. So he waited. The truth came 2 weeks later. It was a cold Thursday morning, frost glittering on every blade of grass like tiny shards of glass. Dolores wasn't at her usual stop. Raymond pulled up to the curb, the bus door hissing open, but the sidewalk was empty. His heart gave a little jolt, the same way it had during the storm months ago. He waited longer than usual, ignoring the side eyes from his passengers, but Dolores didn't appear. By the end of his shift, he'd made up his mind. As soon as he clocked out, he walked straight to her house, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. When he got there, he knew something was wrong. Her front porch light was off. No smoke came from the chimney. Her mailbox, usually checked like clockwork, was stuffed with envelopes. Raymond's jaw tightened. He knocked on the door hard, his knuckles sharp against the wood. "Dolores, it's Raymond. You in there?" No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, then pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sound. Nothing. That was when Miss Calloway came out from across the street, her thick coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "She ain't there, Raymond," Miss Calloway said, her voice carrying across the street. Raymond turned to face her, his eyes sharp with confusion. "What you mean she ain't there?" Miss Calloway walked up slowly, her breath visible in little white puffs in the cold air. Her sister came and got her 2 days ago, she explained. Said Dolores was heading up to Atlanta for a while. Raymond's brow furrowed deeply. She didn't tell me nothing about that, he muttered, more to himself than to Miss Calloway. Yeah, I thought it was strange too, Miss Calloway said with a shrug. But her sister said it was family business. Raymond stood there for a long moment, his hands on his hips, his breath slow and heavy. He glanced at Dolores's front door like he expected it to swing open any second. It didn't. Atlanta, he muttered, shaking his head. Why wouldn't she tell me she was leaving? Miss Calloway tilted her head, giving him a long, knowing look. Maybe she didn't want you trying to stop her, she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of weight that only older women know how to wield. Raymond didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on that door. Yeah, he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. Yeah, maybe. The next few weeks were the longest Raymond had known in a while. The bus felt emptier without Dolores's voice filling the air. Her spot on the front bench stayed vacant, and every time he glanced at it, something tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He still brought her small things, like an extra piece of cornbread from the diner, only to realize halfway through the route that she wasn't there to take it. He stopped doing that after the second week. It hurt too much. Miss Calloway mentioned that Dolores had written her a letter, but she didn't offer to show it to him, and Raymond didn't ask. It wasn't until late January, after a long, cold week, that the phone call came. It was nearly 9 p.m., and Raymond was already in bed, half asleep, when the phone buzzed on his nightstand. He reached for it, expecting it to be one of his kids calling to ask about the weather or tell him about his grandkids. Hello, he grumbled, his voice rough with sleep. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then, a familiar voice spoke, soft and slow. Raymond, Dolores said, her voice shaky, but still her. His eyes flew open, and he sat up straight. Dolores, he said, his voice suddenly clear. Where you been, woman? He could hear her exhale on the other end, like she'd been holding her breath. I'm sorry, she said, her voice small but steady. I should have told you. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He knew she wasn't finished. I had to go see Isaiah, she continued. They told me he was sick. Those words hit him harder than any storm ever had. What you mean sick? He asked, his voice sharp with concern. She didn't answer right away. He could hear her trying to hold it together, could hear her swallow hard on the other end. He's got cancer, Raymond, she said finally, her voice breaking on the last word. They say it's stage 4. Ain't much they can do. His heart sank into his chest like a stone dropped into a well. Lord have mercy, he muttered, his hand rubbing his face. He sat there for a moment, letting the weight of it settle on him. You staying up there with him? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Yeah, she said softly. I gotta be here, Raymond. He needs me. Silence hung between them like heavy fog. Raymond leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hand gripping the phone tighter. I get it, he said finally, his voice quieter now. Ain't no man alive gonna stop a mama from taking care of her boy. Dolores sniffled softly, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. I didn't mean to leave you like that, Raymond. I didn't. He let out a slow breath. I know, he said simply. But I'm still here, Dolores. I ain't gone nowhere. She was quiet for a long time, and he let her be. Sometimes people just need to sit in the quiet for a while. Over the next few months, their phone calls became part of the new rhythm. Every night at 8 p.m., the phone would ring, and Raymond would answer before the second ring. They'd talk for an hour, sometimes more. She'd tell him how Isaiah was doing, and he'd tell her about his day on the bus. Miss Calloway's still running her mouth, he'd say, making her laugh. Said we was the lovebirds of Willow Creek. She'd chuckle softly and reply she ain't wrong. The day Isaiah passed, she didn't call. But that night his phone buzzed, and when he answered, she didn't say a word. She just breathed on the other end, slow and steady. Raymond didn't say anything either. He sat there, listening to the sound of her breathing, steady as the ticking of a clock. They stayed like that for 20 minutes, maybe more. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but strong. "You still there, Raymond?" she asked. He leaned his head back, eyes closed, and replied, "I'm still here." 3 months later, Dolores came home. She stepped off the number 14 bus with her suitcase in one hand, and when Raymond saw her, he didn't say a word. He just reached for her bag, took it from her, and together they walked in silence toward her house. The azaleas were blooming again. When they got to her front porch, she turned to him, eyes full of quiet gratitude. "You staying this time?" he asked, his voice steady but hopeful. She nodded, eyes shining. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm staying." Raymond smiled, slow and wide, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Good," he said. "Took you long enough."